Hi, everybody. Uh, my name is Frank Manchell, and I'm Ben Manchell's grandfather. I'm also a University of Vermont Emeritus Professor of English and Film Studies, and Ben has asked me to talk to you for a very brief time about the history of women in horror films, past and present. That's a very difficult subject, very complicated. It's hard to do in 5 minutes, but I'll try. Please forgive me if I oversimplify a lot of things. I'll divide what I'm going to talk to you into three major periods: the beginning of motion pictures, the 60s and early 70s of the 20th century, and finally about movies, horror movies today in 2018. We have to begin by reminding you that horror films are as old as the movies themselves. When the movies began, so did the horror film. A horror film is basically what we call a formula. That is, it has predictable characters, it has familiar plots, it has isolated surroundings, it has supernatural monsters, and it has insane villains. And always these small group of isolated people are in danger. What makes the formula important is that it reveals in its story and characters the political and social values of the age in which the film is made. And it also depends upon the technology that's available to the filmmakers. At the beginning of motion pictures, when the horror film began, women were more objects than people. The key film that I'm going to mention just in passing is a film called Nosferatu, which came out in 1922. It's the story of Dracula. Now, it represented the idea that when the movies first began in America, all of the horror came from overseas, not in America itself. It came from strange people, strange countries, people who, in a sense, the immigrants in America were fleeing. The main image was of rich women in these particular films. They were basically virgins. They were people who were not sexually active. They were basically marginalized. They didn't work, almost didn't think. All they really cared about was doing what the men wanted them to do by way of taking care of the house, taking care of the children, and also, in a sense, taking care of the family. The monsters or the madmen in the film would always lust after these women, and it was the job of the man to protect the woman. The women were often silly, they were often weak, they were terribly frightened, and they were always in danger. In fact, in the early horror films, women were the most vulnerable people in the movie, but they had one major redeeming virtue. Somehow, for some reason, these women loved to die nobly so that their loved ones would live. By the end of the film, you weren't able to see any women around. They were long since gone. That all changed as far as women in horror films by the 60s and the 70s. And the reason it changed, because the culture changed, because society changed. It was the age of civil rights. It was the age of the women's movement. It was the age of the Me Too generation. Now suddenly, horror started coming in America, not from overseas, but from America itself. People began to worry women about their identity. Who were they? What was happening to them? They worried about losing their control of their lives. They were concerned about who to trust. They were concerned about being helpless and no one caring what happened to them. The best example of that, and the film that really kicked it off, was a film called Rosemary's Baby in 1968. Here was a woman married to a guy who wanted to further his career, so he makes a pact with the devil. She was innocent. She didn't know what was going on. She couldn't trust her husband. She couldn't trust her friends. She couldn't even trust her obstetrician. So in the end, evil is in the home. Evil is taking charge of her life, and she does her best to survive. But basically, she's alone. When she tries to tell people what's going on, nobody will believe her. By the time they finally believe her, then she has to, in a sense, try to struggle on her own 2 feet. Now we come quickly to 2018. And now it's a totally different thing. We have a time when women have a new status in society. Marriage is under attack. A man is no longer needed for a woman's happiness. No one has to get married. And so the conventions of the horror film begin to change. But it's an interesting thing. A new genre basically comes around. It's called the family genre. And the thing that's interesting is that it keeps a lot of the characters and horror effects from the history of the genre, but in order to make it modern, in order to make it interesting to your generation, it has to modernize it. And the best example that I can give you for this little video is a film called A Quiet Place. It is the #1 horror film starring women in 2018. And it's important that you know that movies are a business as well as an art form. So therefore, the secret to how many women are going to be starring in horror films and so on depends how successful the last film was. So if this film is successful, and it is, then you can expect to see sequels, remakes, and imitation. In this film, as for those of you I suspect who have seen it, women are no longer weaklings. They're no longer insignificant. They're no longer objects. They even have their own star. In this film, it's Emily Blunt. It's the story of a post-apocalyptic America. It's in the wilderness. You have the traditional family, consists of a father, a pregnant mother, and you have 3 children. The house where they live is isolated. It's under attack from a series of monsters who can't see. But what the monsters can do is hear. And if you make a noise, you're dead. They know where to get you and they come after you. The movie starts off like the old horror films. In a sense, the man's in charge. It's a patriarchal society. And the reason you do that is people come to see horror films, and they come because of having certain expectations. The secret is to take the expectations that they have and then change it. In this film, when it opens, the father's still in charge. But an interesting thing, the youngest daughter disobeys what her father tells her, and as a result, she makes a noise, and as a result, she dies. So you got the traditional convention, you listen to your father or else you get in trouble. But the conventions then begin to change as you move on. The most frightened person, the person who's scared most in the film, is the son, not the daughter. The daughter, in fact, is one of the bravest characters in the film. She's one of the smartest people in the film. She's one of the most independent people in the film. In the old horror movies, the man would always have to suffer. He'd be attacked, he'd be beaten, he'd be trapped, and he'd always have to get out of it. And that way you saw how good and important he was an individual. In this film, it's the woman who does all the fighting, the woman who does all the surviving, the woman who's the most heroic, the woman who's the most courageous. There's an incredible scene in the movie where this woman, isolated all by herself, gives birth to a baby son all by herself. She escapes from the monster, and during the birth and the delivery and the never once in the entire film, in this entire sequence, does she make a noise. I mean, it's incredible what she goes through. In this film, when the children are in danger and they're about to die, it's the father who gives up his life to save the people he loved, not the woman, not the mother. And in this film, the single mom is the survivor. She is brave, she is courageous, and the only hope for the family in the film is that the woman will fight off the monsters and survive. Now, that's basically an overview of the past and the present. The key idea is that in contemporary horror films, the heroine is always a survivor. The problem is that's all right that she survives and she's stronger, but we don't know what her future is and where it's going to go. Women, in a sense, have a long way to go in the horror films and in society so long as it's run by men primarily. That's it, Ben. Time's up. See you soon.